Welcome to the Elokus podcast. We are now in class number 18 in the first discourse, the discourse of Shehikdimu in the year 5672. We're nearing the end of the first discourse. All the classes of the first discourse were dedicated for the schus of Refuah Sheleimo for Avraham Ben Parvin and for blessings for the entire family. May he be healed amongst all the ill of Israel. We are holding over here in the almost towards the end of the fourth chapter, which will conclude the discourse. Probably another two classes until we're completed with this Maamor. In any case, in the last class, we were talking about how the difference between the Or Pnimi, between the internal light, which from the very get-go, from its very origins, is koichos mugabalim. There are limited powers. Within ourselves, our soul carries limited powers, although the soul is an undefined and unlimited being, yet it contains within itself limited powers. It's just that while they're in the soul, you don't see its limitation. It's not visible at all. These powers are not distinguishable from the soul itself. However, when they do come out, then we can all see its limitation. And therefore, we learned that these powers, once they come out in a form of divisibility. They come out with details, they come out with parts, because everything that's limited has boundaries and limitations. So even the general power contains within itself pieces, as opposed to the soul itself when it expresses itself, which is the power of will. Will is just a revelation of the soul itself. That's why it's so powerful. It doesn't come with pieces. It is indivisible and the like. So in the last class we were learning, this will explain to us in mitzvahs why we find that on the one hand we say that every mitzvah is equal and one should not prioritize or put higher significance and more attention to mitzvahs that one might think are more important, and treat with less devotion and less commitment mitzvahs that are what they might perceive as lesser stature. And when we say we might perceive, let's take it even more than that. Even when the Torah itself indicates that a certain mitzvah is very high priority and another mitzvah is less priority, so the intention, yet we say, there's a Mishnah that says, Al tihi yoshev v'shaykel, you should not sit, and I don't think it's a Mishnah, that is a statement in Midrash Tanchuma, that you shouldn't weigh mitzvahs and say this one is important and this one is less important. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, we find that every mitzvah has a different intention. The kavanah of the mitzvah, the intention of the mitzvah, is different in the mitzvahs. It's not all the same. And the very fact that some mitzvahs are called a minor mitzvah, and the other mitzvah is called a major mitzvah. You see, the sages themselves say that you should treat a minor mitzvah like you treat a major mitzvah. But the very fact that they call it a minor mitzvah means that there are differences in the mitzvahs. And the intention of the mitzvah, the kavanah of the mitzvah, is different in every mitzvah. So how do we reconcile both? And as we discussed in last class, because a mitzvah is a combination of an or makif and an or pnimi, of an encompassing light and a internalizing light. Because as we discussed in last class, originally the mitzvahs all originate in God's will. Over there, from the level of Hashem's will, all mitzvahs are equal. But the mitzvahs, Hashem desired them also to take on, to pass through and to become included in it, also Hashem's moichen, Hashem's intelligence. And since the mitzvahs also pick up on divine intelligence, since, in other words, the mitzvahs that essentially are beyond reason are then reasoned by God, Hashem infuses the mitzvah with a reason as well. Like we gave the example in a person that sometimes things begin in our experiences as super rational, but then we add reason and rationale to an otherwise beyond logical desire. So when the mitzvahs, however, enter the realm of reason, since reason is different, since the oir, since the power, since the light of chachma, of reason, of in general of seichel, of intelligence, is unique. Every single seichel is unique. Every single idea is different, and it comes, as we said earlier, with pieces and with parts to it, with details. For that reason, the mitzvahs also become detailed and they become specified. That's what we learned in last class. Now he's continuing and he says, "Ubeklalis," more specific, more in general, "Hu harfrish bein Torah lemitzvahs." It will be the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. So what we just mentioned earlier is in mitzvahs itself, we should appreciate the nuance of the will of the mitzvah or the reason of the mitzvah. In the will of the mitzvah, all mitzvahs are equal, but in the reason of the mitzvah, mitzvahs are individualized, and then you get all the differentiations of more important parts, less important part, a more important mitzvah. Within each mitzvah, the more essential part of the mitzvah, the less important details of the mitzvah. They're part of the mitzvah, but they're less important. All of that has to do with the chachma of the mitzvah, the wisdom of the mitzvah. And this goes back to what we learned in a few classes ago. We learned that in every seichel, in every concept, there are the more important parts, the more essential elements of the more essential element of the idea, of the concept, and there is the less important pieces. There's still pieces of the idea, and in order to have a complete picture, you need those pieces as well, but they're of less significance to the primary concept like other parts. So in mitzvahs, the same thing will happen. But that's only secondary to the mitzvah, because that's the chachma of the mitzvah, not the mitzvah of the mitzvah, not the ratzon of the mitzvah, not the desire of the mitzvah. In the desire of the mitzvah, there is a sweeping desire, infinite desire of God that encompasses every mitzvah equally and every detail of every mitzvah. Like the Rebbe once put it in these amazing words. You know, everybody knows that when you do bedikas chametz, when you search for the chametz, which is a mitzvah, to get rid of the chametz before Pesach, it is a custom that along when you're doing the mitzvah, you carry a spoon and a feather. You have to have a candle, which gives you the light, and you have to inspect all the cracks and corners and find it. And then there is a spoon and there is a feather. Now, if you are like me, and I think most people are like that, at a certain point of doing the bedikas chametz, you say, what in the world do I need this feather? And what in the world do I need this wooden spoon? It becomes it's like just a hazard. It's like this extra piece of something coming along. No one needs it. No one uses it. It's not like you're going to use the feather and sweep the little crumbs into the spoon and put it in the bag. No one does it. But yet you have to do your bedikas chametz with the feather and the spoon. And even if you're not using it, make sure to keep it in your pocket. Make sure to have it, because this is the custom. So the Rebbe once expressed himself by a Fabrengen, and the Rebbe said, from the perspective of the divine will, the feather of bedikas chametz is just as important as the I think it was like taking the actual chametz and burning it the next day, which is like, getting rid of chametz. If you have chametz on Pesach, you're in violation of the greatest thing. Yeah, but the feather that goes along and the spoon, it's just as the will of God is equal. Because God willed it, He willed it. All the details carry the same will. Will is not divisible. But in terms of wisdom, in terms of the chachma of the mitzvahs, of course there is huge differences. And if you don't have the feather, it's really okay. But if you have but that's all from the perspective of the will of the wisdom of the rationale in the mitzvahs. Here, this is more important. This less is important. Okay, so how does that translate into actual observance? Obviously, you're going to ask a rabbi, and the rabbi will tell you that if you don't have the feather, you can still go ahead and do your bedikas chametz. But if you do have the feather, from a Hasidic perspective, the feather and the spoon should be treated with the same excitement and the same devotion. If you're committed to God's will, then really there shouldn't be any difference in the manner in which you're doing it. Okay, but all of this is in mitzvahs itself. Now the Rebbe says, in order to get to be able to see this in a more clearer form, once you're dealing with one mitzvah, you have to do a little surgery to be able to separate within the mitzvah itself this part and this part, to separate the or makif, the encompassing lights, from the or pnimi, from the internal light. But now let's take a look in an easier way to differentiate it, will be the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. Because Torah is the wisdom of God, and mitzvahs are the will of Hashem. Notwithstanding what we spoke earlier, that mitzvahs also have reason to them, and also we can say in Torah is also a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to study Torah. In that sense, Torah also has God's will embedded in the Torah, so to speak. But yet, we have to look at what is the primary element of each one. In mitzvahs, the primary element of the mitzvah is it's a commandment, it's God's will. In Torah, the primary element of the Torah is that it's the wisdom of God, yet it too is plugged into Hashem's will. But what is the primary and what is secondary? Torah's primary element is it's the wisdom of God. Behind it, in the backdrop, there is a will of Hashem. The Ratzon is also there. But in the mitzvahs, it's the opposite. The primary force of the mitzvah is its will of Hashem, the or makif, the encompassing lights, and in the backdrop, there is the rationale and explanations of the mitzvah. When you're doing a mitzvah, what's supposed to be up in front in a person's consciousness is the simple surrender to God's will. Not trying to figure out what God's reasons are. Why am I doing the mitzvah? It's simply because God said so, I am doing so. Yet, we are also told that every mitzvah you should also try to also get to know the mitzvah and add that as a secondary component to your mitzvah, that you understand the reason that is in the mitzvah. When it comes to Torah study, your primary approach to it has to be, I'm going to engage God's mind through my mind. I'm going to try to match my mind with God's mind. I'm going to try to converge my intelligence with God's intelligence. And yet, in the backdrop, I also know this is God's will, and I'm doing it because God commanded me to do so. Like we say, a mitzvah, Shehikdimu b'mitzvosav. Even by Torah, we say it's a mitzvah we're doing because Hashem said so. But the question is, which one is number one and which one is number two? So in Torah, the primary element of Torah is or pnimi, internal light. In mitzvahs, the primary element of a mitzvah is or makif, encompassing light. I'm just going to say something that he doesn't say in the Maamor over here, just to give it more concreteness. That's why in Kabbalah it says, and we learned about it in Tanya as well, that mitzvahs, our spiritual benefit of a mitzvah is that it gives us a garment. Every mitzvah you do, you give tzedakah, you just received a holy garment for your soul, which you're going to use after 120 in Gan Eden. No one should have to do that because we're all going to live forever now in the days of Mashiach. But there is a garment, and I'm sure the garments will be useful then as well. There is a garment for the soul that is created as a result of doing a mitzvah. In Torah is called nourishment to the soul. It's food for the soul. You used to have daily study, because just like you need to have daily food intake, you need to have daily study. What's the difference between a garment and food? Food, you internalize, you take the food into your body. It feeds you from within. Garments protect you from without. So that's where you see the difference, how mitzvahs are primarily an or makif, an encompassing light, and Torah is primarily an or pnimi. So that's what he continues in the Maamor. Ubeklal is, and in general, hefresh ben Torah la mitzvahs. It's the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. Now, based on the concept that we said before, that an or pnimi is full of details and full of parts, because it's essentially a finite entity, and an or makif doesn't have parts. It's all encompassing and all sweeping. That's why we can see that how that applies to Torah and to mitzvahs. In Torah, you find that there's much division in the Torah. Every part of Torah is different. In terms of its light. Yes, since we said earlier that in Torah is also a mitzvah, and in that is equal in any element of Torah, whether you're studying deep Kabbalah, or whether you're learning practical halacha, whether you're learning Mishnah, or you're learning diktuk, linguistic elements of Torah, where you're learning, gematria, or you're learning midrashic discussion, or you're learning a deep Talmudic debate. No matter which element of Torah you're learning, you're supposed to say a blessing before you learn, and in the back of your mind, you have to know that you're fulfilling a mitzvah because God commanded you, and that is equal in every part of Torah. Yes. However, we all understand that in the experience of study, it's very different when you're learning practical halacha. It's very dry, but on the other hand, you're focused on how to on the instructions of how to live your life and how to do a certain mitzvah and the like. And when you're learning very abstract ideas, where the experience is very, very different. So the learning of Torah is very different in terms of the energy of the learning. And even in Mishnah itself or in Talmud itself, there's a very, very, very big difference when you're learning Masechtas Baba Kama and Baba Metzia. The experience is different than when you're learning Seder Taharis, the laws of purity and impurity. It's a whole different experience because the energy of Chachma is very different. God's wisdom in here and in this takes on a whole different form because that's the way wisdom is. That's the way intelligence is. That's the way Orpinimi is. And he says even deeper than that. V'gam b'haTorah. Now let me just make a little introduction of it. Just another point that you see in mitzvahs, there is also differences. Of course, blowing the shofar is a different experience than giving tzedakah. Or every mitzvah has a different experience. So what are we saying of it? Torah, the experiences are different. And in mitzvahs, the experience is the same. But that's not really the case. Every mitzvah is a very different experience. Dancing by a wedding is one mitzvah. Going to a funeral is a different mitzvah. So how can you compare the two? Going to a funeral and dancing at a wedding couldn't have two different types of experiences than that. So what do we mean it's different? And the answer is like this. In mitzvahs, the object of the mitzvah is different. Whatever the object of the mitzvah is, whether it's a shofar, whether it's a matzah cracker on Pesach, whether it's a giving of charity, whether it's visiting the sick, or a wedding, as we said earlier, or a funeral. Chas v'shalom. But whatever it is, the object of the mitzvah, which means the kelim, is different. The thing in which you are doing the mitzvah. The mitzvahs are considered a lot of times as Ramach Evarim de Malka, the 248 limbs of the king, corresponding also to 248 limbs of a person. The limbs are different because the limbs are different in terms of its keli. The kelim are different. So the kelim of every mitzvah is different, and also the orpinimi of every mitzvah is different. But that's the chachma of the mitzvah. Remember going earlier, we said there is a chachma element in every mitzvah. Yes, that's different. Just like we learned earlier that every keli has its own specific or hanefesh, has its own particular light of the soul. So that, of course, is different in mitzvahs. However, the asher kedishanu b'mitzvahs, that he sanctified us in the mitzvahs, that overwhelming experience that you're doing God's mitzvah, which means the will of Hashem that is being done, that is equal in every mitzvah. There is no difference between mitzvah and mitzvah. There is a singular feeling, I am doing God's will. And remember, in the doing of the mitzvah, that must be 90% of your consciousness has to be, I am doing Hashem's mitzvah. Not what I am doing, but that I am doing God's mitzvah. And that is equal in the flavor is the same. I'm attaching myself to God because I'm fulfilling His will. And in terms of God, the will of Hashem, although here he wants matzah, and here he wants tzedakah, and here he wants shofar, and here he wants a sukkah, here he wants Hanukkah candles, Hanukkah lamps. So the object of the will is different, but the fact but it's his will that he wants, that's the same in every single one. There's no difference between them. Torah, the essence of the Torah, are the concepts of the Torah. The energy, not just the vessel. The energy is different concepts. Every Torah, every teaching has its own wisdom, has its own idea. And the nature of these ideas, every idea is different. Not only is the idea different, the pleasure that is inside the idea. There's a sensation. When you're learning something, you have a sensation. There's supposed to be pleasure when you learn Torah. The pleasure is a different type of pleasure. It's a different type of satisfaction and pleasure that you get when you understand the difficult Tosfos, when you understand the deep Hasidic concept, or some mystical, Kabbalistic experience. The pleasure is different. The ideas are different, which is the primary part of Torah, is its ideas. Every single one is different. Some of them are more powerful. Some of them are less exciting. That's because the Or Pnimi, since Torah is primarily an Or Pnimi, it's internal light, not only from us, but from God's perspective as well. His pleasure in every idea of Torah is different. Hashem's understanding in every part of Torah is different because it's different understanding. It's a whole bunch of different ideas. And therefore, in each element is its own light, is its own illumination. That's the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. The will, mitzvahs, which are primarily will, is equal and uniform in every mitzvah and in every element. Torah, which is primarily intelligence and pleasure. We didn't speak about this too much, but the root, we're going to get to it a lot later in the discourse. I'm not going to spend too much time in this right now. That the root of Or Pnimi, as we go deep in the soul, it's rooted in the pleasure element of the soul, which is even deeper than the will, than the Ratzon element, which is really then astounding, because based on what we're explaining until now, that the infinity of the soul is expressed in will, and the more limited the soul carries limited powers, and that's the root of its Or Pnimi. So how can it be that pleasure, which will be the root of the limited lights, are deeper even in the soul than its infinite expression of will? That's a good question, parenthetical question. It's something to be discussed, and we will come to it later parts of the discourse, so we're going to leave it off for now. But what he is saying is, everything related to Or Pnimi comes in a fashion of differentiation. So and therefore, beginning all the way deep in the soul in the world of pleasure, the pleasure is different in every Torah concept. And obviously also the ideas are different, both to Hashem and us when we study it and when we learn it. In mitzvahs, the primary force of a mitzvah is will, and will is all the same experience. In will, it's the will of the person, does not differentiate, is not divisible. And now let's see how it comes out, how this shows itself in Torah and in mitzvahs. So he says, "V'gamba tainuk shebetorah." Also in the pleasure of Torah, yesh b'zeh chilukim madreges. There's all types of differences, and for that reason, we find an interesting thing. V'zeh inyan shebematan Torah. We find that by the giving of the Torah, al kol dibur v'dibur, on every time that Hashem spoke, parcha nishmasam, their souls took flight. By the way, when God transmitted the Torah and gave us the 10 Commandments, in every single one they died. So the question is, can we understand that speaking to God is overwhelming? Now God was seemingly giving us commandments. Since Hashem was giving us commandments, and the commandment is an encounter with the infinite will of God, and to experience infinity is just too very, very intense. So obviously our souls couldn't handle it. So we were blown out of our vessels. Then it says the angels came and Hashem sent down the dew, which makes Tchias HaMesim. He resurrected the body, and he helped bring body and soul back together. Okay? So now body and soul come back together. So the simple way of learning it was the blast of God's will was so powerful, it overwhelmed them. They died. They couldn't handle it. Then Hashem brought their souls and bodies back. I mean, he resurrected them. Now, why didn't they die a second after their souls came back into their bodies? It was because the commandment was over. It was that revelation. It was like they were being buzzed by God. They were being like, they experienced like this powerful electrical current. And now Hashem is not, the current was over. So they can live again. Then he buzzes them another time. When he buzzes them again, so again they couldn't handle it, they died again. Now I'm saying that he buzzed them with electrical current. Sounds very negative. No one wants to die and be electrocuted, God forbid. So let's change that. It was a buzz of incredible exhilaration, but it was exhilaration. It was an infinite exhilaration. They couldn't handle it. So the simple way it was, they came back together again. Now he buzzes them again with this infinite exhilaration. They died again. But the deeper meaning is, it's not like, the deeper meaning is not that they came together again because it was over. The reason, when Hashem sent down the special dew, that he's going to resurrect the dead, means, just like in the time of the resurrection, we're going to be able to handle the God's presence in our lives and not die. It means that when God resurrected them, means he gave them the ability to handle it, body and soul. Not that the experience was over. They were now able to handle in their physical bodies this infinite experience. But then the question becomes, so then why is it that the next time God spoke, they died again? Weren't they able to handle it already? They should be able to receive all 10. And the answer is, if God would just be giving us mitzvahs, if all that Hashem would be giving us would be mitzvahs, which mitzvahs is the will, then we are right. Then the question would be a question. Once you learned how to handle the will of God through the power of the dew of the resurrection, then you should be able to handle it already forever. But Hashem did not treat them only to his will. Hashem also treated them to his pleasure, because Hashem wasn't only teaching them mitzvahs, Hashem was also teaching them Torah. Torah is Hashem's intelligence rooted in divine pleasure. And as we're saying and learning over here, the pleasure is a different pleasure. Every experience of pleasure is a unique experience of pleasure. Will is uniform. It's the same. Once you can handle the will, once I can deal with your temper tantrum, that's in a negative way, but you get the idea. Once you can handle someone's infinite will, I already know how to handle it. I can deal with it. So once we've received the first commandment and we were able to tolerate it, we wouldn't have died by the second commandment. But since what Hashem is transmitting is not just his will, but he's also teaching Torah, and Torah is rooted in divine pleasure, every pleasure is a different experience. So the dew that gave us the ability to experience the first and one kind of divine pleasure didn't make us ready for the second commandment. So we needed to be reconstructed, and we were blown away by the second commandment, and the same by the third, and the same by the fourth. This is the idea that he is sharing with us over here. As a Hashem, we shall continue exploring this amazing exploration tomorrow. Meanwhile, let Mashiach be here today.